Hey everybody, this is Jason with Curious About Cannabis. Before we get started in today's episode, I want to make a brief announcement about something that I am super excited about, and I'm really hoping that you'll be excited about it too. And that's the release of our Curious About Cannabis workshop series. Now, I've been teaching these workshops for years, since like 2015, but always in an in-person classroom environment. And this is the first year we're launching it virtually and opening up to anyone in the world, really, that has an internet connection and a passion for learning. I've really found that these workshops are particularly valuable to medical cannabis patients, their caregivers, as well as clinicians like doctors and nurses, pharmacists, and anyone who's wanting to get involved or has recently gotten involved in the cannabis industry, whether it's on the medical cannabis side, the adult use cannabis side, or in the hemp market. This workshop series is really designed to not only provide you with a solid foundation of knowledge about the cannabis plant and about cannabinoids and the endocannabinoid system and all of these different concepts, but it's also designed to empower you with tools and resources so that you can find high quality information on your own and you can evaluate that information, and so that you can teach yourself once you leave the workshop and continue your education on your own. So it's not just about empowering you with knowledge, but also empowering you with the tools and resources to seek out more knowledge in the future, well after the workshop is over. So if you're looking for an opportunity to work alongside me and some of my colleagues and other people that you've heard me interview here on the podcast, then you definitely want to check out this workshop series. So you can learn more and you can get signed up for our upcoming session at www.cacpodcast.com/learn. That's www.cacpodcast.com/learn. And as always, thanks so much for tuning into the podcast and continuing to support our work. And a special thanks to our patrons that have been supporting the podcast through recurring monthly donations. The podcast definitely would not have gone on this long without your support. So thank you so much. With our patron support, we've been able to now offer over 60 hours of educational cannabis and cannabinoid science content through the podcast platform. So I'm eternally grateful for that. So with that, thanks so much for entertaining this short little announcement, and let's not waste any more time. Let's get back to the show.
Hi, my name is David Heldreth. I'm with Panacea Plant Sciences and Ziese Farms. Panacea Plant Sciences is a biotech company primarily focused on increasing yields for metabolites in plants and fungus and bacteria. And then for Ziese Farms, we're focused on expanding the use of the hemp plant beyond seed or smoking and things like that.
You're listening to the Curious About Cannabis podcast. Hey everybody, this is Jason with Curious About Cannabis. Thanks so much for tuning in once again. So today I am super stoked because I'm finally, after years of us, I've been following this person and we've sort of been chatting on social media and everything. We're finally getting around to connect with each other on the podcast. But I'm here with David Heldreth Jr. David, thanks so much for being willing to come on the podcast today.
Oh, thank you for having me. I mean, we've had a lot of great conversations about things, so it's good to maybe put some of it on tape.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that's the whole goal. Try to capture some of this stuff and share it. And I mean, David, there's so many different ways we could launch into all of the different things that we have to talk about today. I mean, one of the things that listeners just heard you mention are your two companies. So I guess let's just start there and then we can spin out in all sorts of directions. So can you describe, I mean, you've already kind of described a little bit about those companies and what you do, but there's a lot more behind sort of those basic descriptions. And you have a lot of, one thing I really like about your work is you're very forward thinking and kind of how you want to work with plants and where you see things going. So do you mind just kind of giving listeners a little bit of background on yourself and kind of how Panacea Plant Sciences and Ziese Farms came about, and what your kind of general mission is with both of those entities?
Definitely. I'm originally a medical cannabis patient since 2003, I believe it was when I first got my first recommendation. I've had a variety of back and knee surgeries, as well as previously had issues with PTSD and things from childhood. Don't want to get too much into that, but just and then due to that, I had positive experiences with these items, and so due to that, I wanted to be able to research and get involved in this. I also have a history working as a journalist for many years. So the crossover, and I was originally researching or going to school for aeronautical engineering and marine biology. And so it ended up being a crossover kind of in the time period from the time when I was in college till, and when that was happening. And so it kind of changed my trajectory. And National Geographic had always been, I guess, a goal for me, because that kind of combines those ideas. A lot of my family are teachers. So my aunt is a microbiologist. And so because of those things, I think it's kind of framed who I am in my drive. And so that's why I think I just have always wanted to share information. But then at a certain point, I actually got fired from a job at a newspaper because I was speaking out at city council meetings in my hometown regarding the allowance of cannabis dispensaries in the city. I was the sports editor at the time, and basically I had stated during a city council meeting that people who disagreed with the mayor should approach her and discuss this subject with her. And she reported it to the police as a threat.
Oh my gosh, wow.
I mean, I said this on TV. And so it just became, I mean, I understood, it's interesting for a newspaper to fire someone over a free speech issue, kind of. And then the police never did anything because that's not a crime to tell someone to approach their council person.
In fact, it should be encouraged.
But it also made me reticent to speak about these subjects for a while, and also kind of it just framed a lot. So there was a time period where I pulled back from this community, and then I feel like basically there was a moment when ketamine helped me come back from the depression from that. And it was a transformative experience for me. And it's something that I don't speak about very often. I mean, I talk about the ideas, but I don't speak about the experiences. And one time, just a single time, and it just removed that and allowed me to then come back to the cannabis and psychedelic space in terms of research and sharing information about it without being scared. Because technically these items are illegal and, federally. And so you kind of are putting, I mean, less so now than previously, but especially, in 2005, you were putting yourself in a much different position, let alone trying to research these things. And then I was lucky enough that I ended up, once I made that decision, I left journalism and I went into working in a medical cannabis collective. And I was lucky enough to run into the workshop, and they were offering testing services for cannabinoids and terpenes, and they were creating blends and for putting them back into extracts very early. They were the first. I know Steep Hill was offering cannabinoid testing, but as far as I know, the workshop was offering terpene testing previously.
I think so,
just being able to have access to that data from things we were growing and from all the stuff that was being sold, and seeing that and seeing the effects of it just changed everything. And then the internet with Google Scholar, which, the ability to use Google Scholar and Sci-Hub to access data, the combination of those things all kind of happening simultaneously in that, 8 years ago time period. I mean, it's just exploded my personal life in a positive way, and as well as I feel the world. So I guess that kind of frames why I've started these things. So, and then that also framed how I was able to gather the data, because without the workshop or other groups providing the testing services to measure the cannabinoids and terpenes, there was no way to quantify the research.
Yep. Yeah, and you're really highlighting this like special time period, because I remember, yeah, this time period between like 2006, 2007 or so up until it was like 2014 when hemp programs started to kind of go underway under the pilot programs and everything. You started to kind of see that hemp wave starting, but there was this special period of time where things really started to come together. I have You and I have a lot of very separate but similar sort of parallel stories in a way, because mine is sort of similar. That I was a medical cannabis patient, but was kind of hiding from things for a while because it was sketchy. I mean, yeah, definitely all the way up until like 2008 or so, it was still quite sketchy to really put your face out there and your name out there associated with cannabis or psychedelics or anything. But um, similarly, I come from a family of teachers, which is one reason why I'm so passionate about science communication and everything, and likewise issues with like PTSD, and I'm also bipolar, and I've had some very transformative experiences through cannabis and psychedelics, and that's one reason why I also decided to take the leap and finally be like, okay, we're just going to embrace this and see where it goes, and see what happens. So, you know, um, that's super fascinating to learn. That you kind of went through all of that, and you're mentioning. I think a lot of people nowadays don't even remember when Google Scholar wasn't around, but it hasn't always been here. And this time period, yeah, when Google Scholar came about, and then when Sci-Hub got going, which anyone who's not familiar with Sci-Hub, it's essentially a site. Sometimes the website changes if it gets shut down, but they collect research papers and open them up to the public. And there's controversy around that. And technically, I can't recommend people do it, but it's a resource that's out there, that is available, and you can essentially use Google Scholar to find papers, use Sci-Hub to get open access to the full text of those papers, and then, I mean, you talk about a renaissance of intellectualism and education and stuff, self-education and everything. I mean, I have a daughter that's 2 years old now, and I'm like, geez, she's going to be so much smarter than me, given the access to information and experiences and perspectives. I mean, it's going to be incredible. So I think that your story and my story and those sort of similarities. I think a lot of people that are around our age, I think we're probably similar in age. I think a lot of people in our sort of generation have gone through that similar sort of transition of being able to finally acknowledge the roles that some of these plants and these plant compounds and entheogenic plants and things have played in our lives, and then being able to openly express that interest. Like, we want to understand why these things work. What are the proper applications and limitations? What safety issues are there actually? And being able to really do true hands-on research. I mean, it's a really incredible time. And then how did that? And I want to come back around to the journalism thing, because I know that you're a huge fan of Hunter S. Thompson, like I am as well. So we'll definitely talk about that. But how did that transition lead to starting to get some feedback on terpenes and everything, to I'm going to turn this into some serious businesses, and I've got some ideas of where I want to really see these things go in the future?
So around that time period, I also discovered or not discovered, because I had previously used psilocybin mushrooms and they had been helpful, but not as much. But at that time period, I just was like, I'm going in, I'm just doing these things. I'm not going to be scared anymore. And during that time period, there was a group in the Los Angeles area, which was interesting, called the, God, what was their name? Weird Hollywood Youth, I believe. And literally they would have events where people would gather and have barbecues at the abandoned zoo in LA, and everyone would drop acid. And, and it's just things like that. And there were interesting situations, but you ran into scientists and other people at these types of things who had similar interests. And over time, while I want to share information, I believe that a lot of these things are going to be patented and controlled by people over time. And the only way to get the money that you then need to continue your research is to have a patent and to sell the research to somebody, typically. And also, if you own the patent, you can control how it gets used. And so eventually the goal would be to find a group like MAPS, who is, I don't know if everyone who watched it, probably most people will know what that group is. We can get it in a moment, but a group that does basically is creating I would describe as a non-profit model for psychedelic therapy, I suppose, or at least for a psychedelic therapy pharmaceutical company is their goal. And to be able to create technology that you license to groups like that to help them create lower cost products, and then you just get the money back for what you developed it for, and try and develop partnerships like that so you can reduce costs for pharmaceutical development and also allow it for use in recreational and other markets. So seeing maps form at that, which is also not formed because they were older, but the success they've had with MDMA in that time frame kind of reflected me seeing that vision and kind of applying it, but to the plant sciences portion of it, I suppose. And so that is kind of our long-term goal. And so by gathering that data, I started noticing how these plants were changing based on growth environment. The same clone, the same exact plant. And then GW Pharmaceuticals, what's his name? Their cultivation expert had filed his thesis paper on the optimization and characterization of cannabis sativa. And their goal was to control everything to make it exactly the same every time. Mm-hmm. I saw that and saw every way that there was variation. Yep. And was like, how can I manipulate these yields to achieve these other things? And so you could increase these other cannabinoids that they weren't thinking about, or that they thought of as impurities in these studies. And so then you start noticing these pathways, and you notice at different temperatures or different phytohormone levels or all these different potentials for manipulating the plant. And this is, I think he published that paper. I saw it in 2008 or 2009. It used to be on GW's website. And then they removed, and then they took it down. They used to have published, early on they had all their published papers linked there.
They had a great educational section and stuff and talked about the genetics. It was great.
Yeah, and then it all just disappeared one day. And so, but that information, along with the workshop stuff, and then what I was seeing by getting the data from the workshop, and seeing also just seeing every product that we brought in, because we were doing pesticide. That's the other thing is we were doing pesticide testing. We were doing mycotoxin testing. We were testing for potency of CBD, THC, and CBG for and acids, and we were and then I think it was 8 terpenes, and we were averaging the potency test from 3 random picks and averaging it, and this was 12 years ago or 8 years ago. And it's painful to see what the industry has become. In ways the medical was worse in some places, but it was far better in others.
Yeah, and can you elaborate on that? Because one thing I really want to make sure we spend time talking about is how the cannabis industry, and when I say cannabis, I'm talking about medical, adult use, and hemp altogether, how it's all evolved and some of these trends. Yeah, so do you mind elaborating on some of those things that you noticed? Because some of the things that you're talking about right now, just basic sampling protocols, are things that we're still struggling to get companies to adopt on their own and to see the value and to recognize the value of data sets that can be validated and what it takes to create data sets that can be validated and everything like that. So yeah, share what you've noticed and kind of how the industry has evolved for better or worse.
So as I was saying, it's better and worse, is that initially when we were doing this, and I'm sure people like the workshop and Steve Hill can indicate, there wasn't a whole lot of people utilizing their services because they didn't have to. But the people who did really cared. And so what it allowed is that we could develop these systems. And so groups like ours created, this intricate way to ensure that you were getting a standard. We were identifying, you might get variation, but at least our goal was to we're hitting the middle. We're your potency is going to go one way or the other, but at least the number we're giving you will tell you compared to what everything else you're getting from us is. And so we could know because we were using the product. We needed to know this so we know what to use. And I think that's also the difference in medical versus recreational, is that you see this transition, not that the people who were in recreational don't utilize the product, but that there's not the same objectives. And so now there's people who want to test larger and larger lots for items instead of smaller and smaller lots, and do I get more granular in terms of detail? And that's because of cost. And I understand that from a business perspective, but then I also dislike it from a consumer and data perspective. But coming back to my history with journalism and my family as teachers, and my aunt being a microbiologist, for having those types of backgrounds, Upton Sinclair was one of my heroes as a child. And so his book, The Jungle, led to the FDA.
Yep.
Eventually, yeah. He created systems that led to the rules on journalism, the first code of journalism ethics. We need regulation because, unfortunately, human beings will do anything.
Yes.
I don't know. Yes, it's the best and the worst part of us is that we're infinitely creative.
Right. And you have to consider humans as, it's nature. Nature explores all energetic pathways, and you tend to notice the more stable ones more often, but it's exploring everything, and humans are the same way. If given a chance, there are some humans out there that will take advantage or do things that put people at risk, do things poorly. And this is something that early on, one reason why I started to follow you is because you were one of the only other people in the industry that I heard talking about the FDA, not in a combative way, but in a sense of like, hey, you need to understand what's in the CFRs and what GMP actually is and what it means for something to be grass. Hey, do you know what intended use means? Because grass it's not just this universal thing. And I wasn't hearing anyone else other than myself. And I felt like I was screaming into a void trying to help people understand why regulations are actually important, and why, if you're not taking the time to wrap your heads around, one, why those regulations are in place in the first place, why is the Food, Drugs, and Cosmetics Act, in existence, and what does it say? How does it control things? I just worry that companies are not setting themselves up for success in the future because they've been so resistant to the FDA, the DEA, and I get it, because governmental forces have sort of been this major antagonistic thing to the industry for so long. But it's refreshing to hear you talk about that there is value in these regulations, because unfortunately humans are going to do whatever they can get away with. Maybe not you or you or you, but someone around here is going to do whatever they can and try to make money and just get away with it and disappear into the night. And they don't care if they hurt anybody, poison people, or whatever. It's, they're just focused on the short-term gain.
Oh, definitely. And it's unfortunate because that raises costs and barriers to entry for the market in general. Yep. And then that plays to the people who have more money, which is, I don't agree with necessarily, but It's an unfortunate side effect of it. And that's why I think in some ways I lean towards the idea that government should be either providing grants or developing infrastructure that is communally shared to reduce barriers to entry, rather than just requiring licenses that cost more money. They should create some of this infrastructure so it evens the playing field. And sometimes it's going to be testing services. Sometimes it could be grants so private industry can buy these things, but then that private group gets it and someone else doesn't. So I'm not saying that I know exactly how these things should be structured, but there's other solutions rather than just letting large corporations do it. And I think that's why the large corporations and the people going to prison, I think, are why people have a large distrust of the federal government. And I understand it. And I obviously did as well. But then having been a journalist, I had a lot of interaction with law enforcement, and I had a lot of interaction with the federal government and with local government. And I covered, I also was a city courts reporter. I lived in the British Virgin Islands and covered things there. I've worked at a newspaper in various states and covered local government up to state government. You learn a lot. And as you learn about regulation, you also get less worried about just asking questions. And that's the thing I think people should do is go to city council meetings. You have a question about a paper, write the author that wrote the study if you don't understand it. We don't always have time to answer, because I write papers too, but sometimes we do. You have a question from a journalist who wrote an article about a tax, write the journalist. His email's usually at the bottom of the story.
Yep. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, how I, some of the researchers I get on the podcast, how do I do it? I find papers that I like and I look at the primary authors and I find their contact information and I start a conversation. Like I think, absolutely there's this perspective of separation or disconnect between, sort of the public and writers or scientists, or regulators, all that sort of thing. And, something I try to encourage people, especially in the hemp space, since it's a little further along in scaling and everything, is, do you realize that the FDA often contracts your state Department of Ag and stuff to do FDA inspections? So it's usually a good idea to form a good relationship with your local folks. Like, they are your feds a lot of times. I mean, and not being afraid to just ask questions and speak up. And if something doesn't make sense, get clarity. Don't just hover in that uncomfortable gray area and sort of be like, well, we're just going to do it and hope for the best. I've found that in general, most regulators are very supportive. Like, they want to see businesses succeed and they want to see good examples of cannabis businesses operating. And so when people speak up, they're like, okay, you must want to do things right. And in general, it's been very rare that I've seen regulators be dismissive or anything like that. Every now and then you get these regulators that are very anti-cannabis or whatever and are trying to kind of hold things up, but they usually don't last long, working in systems that are involved in cannabis anyway. So that's a great point to raise. Absolutely. I'm right there with you.
So it's an interesting transition towards recreational. And on like the safety front, there's right now in Washington State, there's discussion about limiting THC content in the recreational market potentially. And I don't believe in bans or limits for that in terms of not allowing the product on the market, because that'll just push people to unregulated product. But one thing I do support is that I'm not sure how much you've seen. I'm sure you've seen some of the stuff I posted about it, but that just the correlation between the 5-HT2A receptor and the CB1 receptor and the heteromers, and the length of use and the age of start and the amount you use and and again, genetics and other factors and all kinds of things correlate in that. So it's not going to be a problem for everyone, but there is a correlation there. And based on that, also CBD and CBG have similarly shown to reduce those things. So I think while places are doing things like taxing sugar higher and taxing, liquor that's, pure alcohol versus beer more, that perhaps a similar model may be better. And I believe that taxes are generally too high on cannabis. So more along the lines I view of the idea of removing or reducing taxes on things that are below certain THC contents. As a way to increase the safety in the recreational market, because I don't believe in bans. I believe everyone should be able to purchase something, but if you need to have things like that, so you incentivize people to make decisions that are beneficial for health, I believe. And I also believe you should have home grow, and allow people to do things for themselves, so that way if they choose to not participate in the market but they want to access it, they don't have to deal with that. Yep,
I totally agree. The options should be available. And in general, I always feel very strange, this idea of prohibiting people to grow plants. It just is strange. I don't know, I'm just sort of on that page of like, I just don't think that should ever be a thing. If people want to grow cannabis plants, they ought to be able to. If they want to grow San Pedro cactus or, whatever that they're into, if they're making decisions, they're adults and, they're responsible for themselves.
I think that's happening. We're seeing the world shift in that direction. At least, Biden on the 16th, did you see his comments about, he stated that he didn't believe that people should go to prison for drug use anymore.
Good. I know he's been getting a lot of pressure to issue pardons to nonviolent drug offenders. I hope we see that, because that's been one of the big things lacking in a lot of, as states roll out legalization and stuff, there's usually a big missed opportunity to actually let people out of jail that really should have never been there in the first place. And it's, I laugh about it, but it's actually a really sad, terrible thing. And so I hope to see some action on that. And this segues really well into connecting to what we're just talking about, but kind of forward looking. Another thing that you talked a lot about after the Farm Bill of 2018 was released, that I was really happy to see, is you were kind of like, everyone take a pause. The Farm Bill doesn't do what you think it does. And just because hemp is legal, that doesn't mean you can just throw cannabis constituents into foods, and you're just entering the world of FDA regulation. And then there's this new, all these other things you have to do. And so I want to talk about that a little bit. If the federal government does deschedule cannabis, which more and more they're talking about doing. Chuck Schumer was talking about that recently, of kind of trying to look at all of the bills that have been proposed recently and trying to take the best parts and come up with something that takes the social equity pieces as well as the descheduling and everything, and try to get it pushed through maybe this year. But I think we're going to see a very similar thing to what happened with the Farm Bill, that cannabis will get descheduled. People will celebrate. Oh, this is amazing. Now we can, the industry can really start to do its thing, without maybe realizing, what are the requirements to put something sort of new into the food, supply chain, or into dietary supplements, herbal supplements, and even cosmetics. And so let's just talk a little bit about what's required let's start with grass, because I think that's a very misunderstood thing. Can you describe a little bit about what grass is and how it applies to cannabinoid products now in the hemp market, but also looking forward to a potentially descheduled, future for cannabis? What should producers be thinking about in terms of FDA compliance as far as grass is concerned?
Oh, this is great. Do you mind if I take a step back in the description of why, just to frame it? So, the way I like to explain it to people is that if you go to a smoke shop, you can often buy salvia or some other smoke blend or some of these compounds, but it usually is, and for a while, I don't know if you still can, there's probably some, but bath salts were also a legal chemical that you could purchase. But it never said that it was for human consumption.
Right.
Because it is not a controlled substance, or those items weren't a controlled substance, but they are not approved for human consumption. And that is the line. And then that then frames, well, what does it mean to be approved for human consumption? That means that the FDA has approved it either as a food, which we'll get into that what all that means, a drug, which is easy, or a supplement. Cosmetics, and cosmetics. Right. And so cosmetics have their own rules, and then drugs have their own rules. And then you have supplements, which have their own rules as of 1992, due to the Food and Supplement Act, which frames what you can do with supplements. So, and that is for things like tinctures or pill form. So if you're going to create a formulation that is in those types of formulations, then it's not going to be regulated as a food, or it's going to be regulated as a supplement. And so you're going to need to follow those rules. But then if you want to put into an item that is categorized as a food or a beverage, which is basically the same, and that is, of course, separate from alcohol or tobacco as well.
Right. All these layers.
Then it would be the FDA, and it would be through either the generally regarded as safe pathway or the food additive pathway. Mm-hmm. And so the difference in those is primarily just different regulations. They almost require the same amount of science. There's slightly different requirements for each. Some of the main requirements for the GRAS pathway is that all the data must be public. It has to be public studies for that. And so, but it's also faster typically. So you don't have to submit a GRAS application to the FDA currently. They're allowing what's known as self-affirmed GRAS, which means you can do all the studies, hold the panel, and then basically just never tell them and just start selling it, which is interesting.
And be prepared to defend yourself.
Yeah, because at any moment they can question it. Mm-hmm. And there's a lawsuit right now that is actually waiting on the judge to finalize it federally against the FDA, saying that that's not legal under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act and that they have to review it. And that hearing last court date was in October. And so any day now we could hear a judgment, which could change that. So I just want to frame that. So just to make it more complicated.
Right.
And then the food additive pathway is if you're going to get a little bit more proprietary information, things like that. And you don't want everything to have to be public data and you just want to submit to the FDA more directly. And it's also wider allowance for uses than you would get in a grass pathway. Because as you said earlier, intended use, because it's generally regarded as safe for whatever use you are using it for that they approve. You may be able to do studies that show indications for safety for a wider category, but you have to, it's the broader that category is, the more data you're going to need to support that.
And the more expensive it's going to be, and more resource intensive.
So, and I think that as this moves forward, that I believe that what Schumer said is that they plan on consolidating the bills. So I believe that what they're going to do is merge. And I also, from talking to hemp people like the Roundtable and the Industry Association, that it seems like most likely, I personally I don't know, but I don't think that CBD bill for supplements right now that's in Congress is going to pass. I think that's going to get folded into that bill. I think it's going to become a giant like cannabis omnibus, which will basically just it will include the allowance for certain hemp products to be in foods. I believe it'll set a limit. I believe that it'll raise the THC in hemp to 1%. I believe we'll see smokable hemp or recreational cannabis, which will be things above certain THC limits, which will be regulated separately for all of these things. But we'll just talk about hemp, but basically THC will mimic this, I believe, just in a different layer, because that's basically what alcohol does, for food or
it just makes sense.
And tobacco, same exact things. And so, but then you'd have like the TTB involved additionally, if it was those, and so then you'll end up with them approving those items, so then you'll see the THC level go to 1%, and then you'll see those, they'll set a limit for supplements and foods, I believe, for items like CBG and CBD. I believe that they'll change the definition of THC to include all isomers of THC, because I spoke with the White House and had meetings with the White House and the FDA when they were doing those hearings for the CBD and hemp policy, and their biggest issue was about drug testing. And also I brought up Delta 8 and other things to them. And because, like you said, I'm never going to be the person that's just going to hide things and let it no, I want to know, and I want you to know so we can regulate and get this over with, because it's going to happen. And the faster we get this resolved, the quicker the market can just become an industry and go to baseline. And so I'm putting everything on the table. And so they're concerned about even CBN for psychoactivity and drug testing. And because it's hard for controlling, as you get regulation, as it becomes legal, that will be less important. But it's still important for things like people who drive trains or have commercial driver's licenses or things. Even if it's legal, it's going to make it difficult for them to indicate if this person's intoxicated on the job. And so I think there's still going to be regulations which will restrict certain classes of people from being able to use these things until we develop testing which can allow them. It's unfortunate, and I don't like that, but there's all these weird subcategories, these aren't necessarily things that I want. This is just what I think is going to happen.
It's the practical reality. Yeah.
So I would just like to say that, because sometimes people get really mad at me when I say these things.
Oh, I know. I experienced the exact same thing. I've had to stop myself several times and explain to people, this isn't what I want. It's just what I think is practically going to happen. Just understanding the way these things go, the way that typically these organizations handle these types of issues. They've already set certain precedents, and for them to do things drastically different would require a lot of other things to happen that is just very unlikely. And I totally agree. The Delta 8 thing is something that's been on my mind a lot. I was talking to someone that runs a lab on the East Coast very recently about it, because they were asking, what's the deal with Delta 8 THC? Why don't people realize most of it is synthetically derived and has all of these, different isomers in it that we haven't identified?
Essentially all of it. If it's
pretty much all of it. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, if it's in a significant concentration, then it's either been synthesized or it's been derived from something that shouldn't have been in the hemp field in the first place. But it's tricky. And Delta 8, I've been telling people, I mean, to government regulators, I mean, that's synthetic drug manufacturing. That's the way they see that, and that's just the way it is. And as far as the future of the definition of total THC in hemp, I've been telling people since the Farm Bill passed, they're going to change it to total tetrahydrocannabinoids. I guarantee you they're going to change it. That's the way the DEA thinks about it already. It's just already there, and it was just a hiccup in their minds of how the language was put together in 2018. And I think I agree with you that I think that there's going to be this massive consolidation where they address a lot of the hemp stuff and the THC rich cannabis stuff pretty much all at once. And if they don't, sort of depending on how long it takes them, then I think at a minimum, when the Farm Bill is revised, that a lot of these things will happen then too, like the total THC definitions, which will then take care of the Delta 8 issue altogether, and the CBN issue, depending on how what language they use to write it up.
Well, England has a one where they use cannabinoids instead of even tetrahydrogen, and so it captures both. And so that, like, because because that's the other thing is you start looking at what other countries, what the World Health Organization and UN, because all these things inform each other.
Yep.
And so like the governments are all working together. And so while things are going to be different, like these things, like you said, they're not going to create they're not going to create a cannabis bureau. They're not. Yeah. They're just going to put it into all these things. And I think smokable cannabis will fall under all of the regulations that tobacco does. And so vaping products are going to be the same, and it's going to be very difficult to get a pre-roll or to get a vape product federally approved. And it's going to be tobacco and alcohol level approvals. And so once it goes federal, like those are going to be the kinds of things, and there's going to be emission testing that for vaping, and for pre-rolls. I think that it'll be similar to Canada, where you have this situation where the raw flower and extract are the only things allowed upon rollout.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and it scales from there, but it also depends on two things, and that's on which of these two models they take. Does this go with a states' rights MORE Act rollout, or does this go with a none of what existed before matters federal system?
Yeah.
Because I think either one is likely, and if it's the second, then everyone in the industry is screwed.
Mm-hmm. Well, and this relates to two things. One, I want to eventually loop this around to what you've done with Ziese Farms and what you've gone through to get FDA approval to use hemp leaves in food, which is really cool. But before we get to that point, and maybe we can intertwine these two things, what do you think producers should be doing right now to not just to prepare, because this is beyond preparedness. This is stuff that like should be already happening. Yeah, lobbying. Yeah. Well, and beyond that, all these CBD producers, and now, I mean, it's the CBD industry is now a misnomer because CBG, CBN, Delta 8, all these things have, now just rushed into the hemp market, especially. I can ramble about all the things I would recommend to people, but what are some of the sort of first steps you think that these companies that really want to play the long game and want to survive these transitions, what should they be thinking about? What should they be doing?
Getting federal approval. Well, in hemp, we'll start with hemp because it's easier. I mean, it's basically the same thing, but just once legalization. Trying to get GRAS studies done on these compounds, because everyone's obsessed with CBD, but guess what? CBG isn't in so here's the thing is we haven't talked about the Epidiolex issue with preemption. So the reason why CBD hasn't been allowed in food, because people have conducted gender regarded as safe studies for it.
That's right.
The reason why all of that is illegal is because it was already put into a drug, and they started those drug trials before it was legally allowed in any food, which means it can't be. Because why would a pharmaceutical company develop a product that can then be in the food supply? And why would our FDA want a pharmaceutical ingredient in the food supply? So the combination of these things And so that preempts that. And that's why it also preempts its use in supplements. And honestly, the supplement bill will only allow CBD or hemp ingredients in supplements, because of also additionally, it won't allow it in foods as it's written.
Yep.
And so, apologies. And so, but basically, because of this, you could be doing cannabigerol or cannabichromene and on and on and on, terpenes, essential oils, because even the essential oils from from hemp are not allowed in food use, because even though those compounds are pretty much, every single one of them has been identified almost as generally regarded as safe in something else, that formulation hasn't been. And realistically, you don't know the genotoxicity or things potentially of every mixture. And the other thing is that every variation in cannabinoid or terpene profile will require a different approval.
Yes. Yeah.
And so sorry.
You just touched on something I just want to highlight real quick that's really important, because it comes up a lot, in that the cannabis industry talks so much about entourage effect. But when it comes to this issue you just mentioned, that every formulation is unique and you don't know what the potential safety and toxicity profiles of unique formulations are going to be, when that comes up, everyone runs to preclinical research on isolated components and tries to use that to promote safety. Whereas then on the other side, when they start talking about herbal cannabis and whole plant extracts and everything, they want to talk about entourage effects and how valuable and important they are. And it's like, you can't have both. Like this
can't have your cake and eat it too.
Right. Yeah. So I just wanted to just highlight that point, because it's a major sort of hypocrisy that comes up a lot, that we want to use preclinical research to talk about therapeutic effects and safety and toxicity and stuff, and then of newer products. But then we try to run to synergistic effects and entourage effects to defend, herbal, cannabis and whole plant stuff. And I think there's a lot to synergistic effects and everything, and I'm not trying to downplay that, but it's just like, if you're recognizing that that's a thing, then you have to recognize that every unique formulation
it's a double-edged sword.
Yes, absolutely. Yep.
So the thing is the other flip side of that is that unique formulations are also being patented. So right now GW Pharmaceuticals is being sued by Canopy. Canopy bought a company for $250 million or so, and got this patent, which appears to be one of the earliest CO2 patent for this. So I'm sure they'll challenge it in court. I mean, that's what's happening. But in the lawsuit, it'll become a challenge on the patent. Or there'll be a settlement, we'll see. And based on that, they could get hundreds of millions of dollars. I mean, the patent expires next year, so it's only going to be good retroactively for people who've used it. But that means anybody who is using that technology in the cannabis industry right now is a target for a retroactive lawsuit. And they can do that forever. So any money you've made using their method over however long, you could owe them. And there's more patents like that. There was a group that had one approved for specific CBD ratios last year. Luckily, that cannabis company went out of business, but someone's probably going to get that IP and start applying it. So there's just and there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these. And I mean, I just filed one. I have a few myself. And that's, again, the reason why. But it's going to become the situation where in order to operate in the industry, you're going to have both patents and regulatory approvals for licenses, and have your product approved by a regulatory agency. And no one in this space has any history with any of those. Well, not no one, because large companies are now bringing those people in because of this. And so I think that those are the things that people need to do. And unfortunately, as a small grower, I don't see them existing in the industry in the long run. And if they do, they're going to be working for a larger entity, like tobacco farmers only farm for Philip Morris. And if you don't want to do that, then you're probably you're going to have a really tough time getting product to market.
Yep.
Or getting regulations. And it's just and that's why, as I said before, perhaps the government needs to socialize some of those costs for systems to provide safety testing. So instead of it being a lab that basically better fund the FDA or whatever group that is, so that way they can conduct that research on the products when people submit them. and subsidize that, or subsidize the cost at least for applications for that. So that way we have more data, because that would be beneficial to everybody. But trying to get the government to spend money is a fun idea.
Right. Yeah. You've got to come to them with a plan on how they don't have to do anything and it's going to take care of itself. And then they might
and make you money.
Approve it. And make you money.
So they're going to want to tax the businesses. And so but then that's the problem, is you end up in a situation where it has to be paid for. And so it's just really difficult to find where to take that money from. I also am for things like getting rid of, obviously, I think that as we get rid of drug crime, because we make drugs legal, that you will simultaneously have a reduction in the need for the policing system and the jail system. And that'll have a drastic reduction on cost. And I think that money saving should be transferred to social equity programs, to programs like this, and to help the people who were previously incarcerated. And so I think that reduction, I think that should be factored in, as well as actually written into these bills.
Absolutely. And this is one reason why I think it's so important to talk about all of this, because there is an opportunity here for, given the traditional systems at play, there is a potential future where we could have the future of the cannabis industry, and not just the cannabis industry, but the future of natural products and everything be more inclusive. Especially as like you're pointing out, I mean, the dominoes are falling with drug decriminalization across the country now. More and more cities and states are starting to put together bills to either decriminalize or, in some instances, sort of quasi-legalize pretty much most drugs in general, and to get rid of drug crime, shift it to a mental health and medical issue, and being taken care of that way. And so there's a lot of budgetary changes that are going to be at play over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, which presents this opportunity to say, okay, how can we move money around to ensure that people are able to farm and everything. And something, bringing up the subsidization thing, early on when Oregon legalized cannabis and changed their testing rules to make them, more rigorous, the industry really cried out and was like, this is way too expensive. We can't afford it. And something that myself and my colleague that I was working with at the time, we kept saying, like, why doesn't the state use some of the tax money to subsidize some of the cost of testing? That's an easy solution and everybody wins. The testing labs, I think people have a very underappreciation for the pressures that testing labs are under, as far as how cash strapped they are to operate, because there's so much pressure for them to offer cheap services that are as fast as possible with the most favorable data possible. And it's very unrealistic. I mean, I come from a background where I'm used to being around traditional natural products labs, and I'm like, geez, 30-day turnaround time is normal in natural products testing, and the costs are like 2 to 3x what we often see in some of these states that have onboarded testing rules, or that don't have testing rules, that have suspect labs operating and doing testing and stuff. And so recognizing that those costs do need to be higher realistically in order to get good data and to ensure that labs are not incentivized to skirt around quality control and that sort of thing, because there's just so much of that. Even if a lab's accredited, which is something I bark about a lot now, accreditation is great, but you can still cheat with accreditation. That's not the end all be all. And really, we need to remove the incentives for labs to issue bad data and to skirt around, different quality controls that they know they need to be doing. And so a great way to do that, subsidize. Just take some of the burden off of the producers, take some of the burden off of the testing labs, and help everything balance out. And ultimately, we end up with better data sets, safer products, and there's not this animosity between different people in the industry that are at different parts of the supply chain. So, we'll see if that happens. But I one of the reasons why I wanted to really have this conversation is I think a lot of well-intentioned people are wasting energy lobbying for things that will never happen, and aren't recognizing the real potential practical steps forward. And so I hope that through this, people are learning maybe some of the things that they should clue in on and focus on. When everyone was barking at the USDA after they issued their rules initially, and everyone was like, "Oh, they need to change the THC level, and they need to change the definition of THC, all these things." I'm like, well, they have to match the farm bill. Like, they can't have rules that are different than the law. So that's not going to happen. And I mean, there's like tons of money being poured to try to lobby changes that it's just not going to happen. And so I guess bringing this all around, let's talk about what your company did to get FDA approval just to use hemp leaves in food, and kind of share maybe some practical steps forward for people beyond what we've just said. And then I know we're getting on an hour. I don't know how much time you have. This hour has already slipped away, but if you have a little more time, I'm happy to keep going. Otherwise, we can wrap it up in just a bit. But I do want to talk a little bit as well, kind of coming back around to the Hunter S. Thompson piece, the role that communication and journalism around these issues plays. Like, one thing I would love to see is a sort of gonzo journalism article about lab testing. Like people that really immerse themselves. Like, I would love to write an article about it if I weren't scared that I'd be sued by somebody. But I'd love to see more of that, because there's an urgent need to get a really unique perspective on some of these things to help people realize kind of what's at play, what dynamics are going on, and what they need to focus on. But I'm rambling at that point. Let's come back around. Let's talk about using the hemp leaves in food. What did that process look like? And how can people kind of learn from what you went through to, kind of accomplish some of their own goals for hemp foods and getting them approved?
So our route was slightly different than most. I actually started this process before hemp was legal, before the 2014 Farm Bill. And initially they wouldn't even talk to me directly about it. Once I said that it was hemp, they like, it's illegal. You can't. Cannabis is illegal. Go
Fair
away.
enough.
Oh, that was a lot. I had that, so I'm working with larger ag companies now that I have this patented, but for that whole time, I was also trying to get a hold of them to get sourcing and things. And that same thing happened. Now, completely different. But literally, I've been saying the same thing. And all these things, it's like I keep saying the same thing. And all of a sudden now the world like thinks I'm a genius and thinks I'm doing. I'm like, I've been saying the same thing. So they basically, eventually they would let me. But before they would, what I did was like, well, what if it was a new species of lavender or spinach? And I wanted to utilize this spinach for people to eat. And because I was a journalist. And the other thing is that I utilized multiple methods of gathering information from government regulations because I own a business. And so when you have a corporation, you contact them, you can get information that is different than you can get if you're an individual, typically.
Yeah. Yep.
Then if you contact them as a journalist, and I do write articles about these things whenever, and then I publish them. And so they will respond to those, and you will get different, and you can request different information. And then as an individual, you can get different information. And so it's not always about, even just one route of attack. It's like you need to hit every aspect possible to try, and gathering your own research separately on what they've done previously. And so basically, and it's also if you get a no, think around the problem. Don't figure out what. And so basically I was like, oh, well, I'm just going to call it something else, get the answer that I need. And then once this is legal, I can come back and have this discussion again, which is what I did.
Yeah.
The other thing is that, like I said, generally regarded as safe, and food additives are the typical allowance. Food, like spinach, is just a food. Like a plant isn't a food additive; it's a food. And so I worked with them to get that clarified and an allowance as a food, whole food. So that's a complicated method, but that was basically the route we went, and we're limited in what it can be used in based on that, though. So it's similar to the grass, where it's intended use. So raw leaf, there's a reason why we have the particular products that we do currently with these allowances. So, and particular cultivars. And so you have to show safety and things. So if we eventually want to extract and like take protein out of it, that's going to require a whole new approval. That's going to be a food additive or GRAS. And we haven't done that. We're working on that right now. We also are we supplied hemp to the University of Kansas State, sorry. I don't know if you heard about their animal food study recently. They're feeding hemp to cows, and they've already reported on the nutrition content levels of the stalk, leaf, flower, I believe roots, seed, flower, post-extracted.
Nice. Wow.
And then they did and then they fed it to cows and got cannabinoid levels for 11 cannabinoids. So now it's going to be the meat and the dairy study.
Wow.
And so we're helping supply hemp to them for these studies. And so we can gather data to apply for the animal applications, because again, just because it's allowed for humans doesn't mean it's allowed for. And so even hemp seed currently isn't allowed for livestock, which is confusing to people, but it's not, because it hasn't been approved, or even for chickens, it's not approved. The Hemp Feed Alliance, oh God, I hope I'm saying their name correctly. I'm not getting the wrong acronym, but just just submitted to, because you can either, for animal feed, you can either go to an ingredient under AAFCO, which is the American Animal Feed Coalition Organization, or something like that. Or Commission Organization. But it's AAFCO, and
I was going to say that gets into an area I really don't know.
Or it's the FDA, and they also will approve animal foods, and so they've applied for that, and so I think it's going to get approved. But it's just being done because, again, somebody had to gather that data, and it's just like there's all of these holes along the way, because people don't realize what needs to be done. And I think that I'm working with the Hemp Industry Association and trying to get some of that type of traction. And the hemp industry, and then the Hemp Roundtable is doing it for like getting that supplement bill passed, or trying to. But I think on the other side we just need to get industry involved to get a CBG GRAS study, to get a CBG food additive study, to get the whole industry should be, otherwise, it's going to end up where this business owns this, and this business owns this, and this business owns this, and everyone will catch up. But do we want that to be the industry? I don't think it'll help farmers or anyone else. So
I totally agree. I like this idea of trying to figure out a way to cooperatively bring the industry together to essentially bring down what you were talking about earlier, these barriers of entry, to really bring them down for most of the smaller players who don't have the money to put together an independent scientific board that's going to organize studies, maybe work with a contract research organization, or find universities or something, to be able to kind of almost have this like research co-op to pursue these GRAS studies and get approvals on things before either a big company does their own, or I still am unclear on what would be entailed if a pharmaceutical company rushed, to get something done with CBG, over the next 2 years.
They could do it quicker than that. I'm sure there's people doing it.
Oh, and
I'm afraid we're going to get beat, and that's what the one question now is, because of the Farm Bill, is how, and it's legal to possess, is that people have made CBG products, but they're not approved for food use. So how would the courts rule that? So that's a new situation. But I believe, again, from the red yeast rice situation, that they would rule in favor of the pharmaceutical companies, because it wasn't a controlled substance there. And, it's a toss up. Again, it would probably come down to a judge.
Yeah. And you just pointed out a good precedent. There's a paper I need to add in the show notes for here, but there's a nice little review paper of sort of regulatory issues facing CBD. It was written like 2 years ago, maybe, or so, but it applies to everything else, CBG and everything else too. But it talks about that issue that you just brought up, and one or two other similar cases where
probably the fish oils, the omega
maybe
oils.
So.
There's that's the only one that's also become a food. That's like the only one.
Yeah.
Like where it's a drug and a food, but it was already kind of used for food before. And so like it's hard for these substances where they have therapeutic and food uses. And so cannabis gets into that, and then the recreational. And so it's like trying to find these. So I think like this cannabis omnibus bill is almost the only way for some of this to happen, because the thing is like, if the FDA had to go back and look at everything we eat now and only approve things that are safe, we wouldn't be eating or drinking a lot of the things in our food supply currently. And they grandfathered in things. And so
Yes.
I think that's something that people also need to be aware of, is that like, don't assume that everything you eat is safe, because like, and it doesn't mean it's horrible, but it just means like we haven't studied it that much, because a lot of things are just grandfathered. And so I'm just applying that in terms of like quantifying risks here, because if we're talking about cannabis this way, I'm like, our food's the same way mostly. So cannabis just wasn't grandfathered.
Exactly. Just because of the way it was handled when a lot of these things were being passed in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Because I think Deshay passed sometime in the 90s.
92,
as well
I
as I
believe.
think that, all of these regulations around foods and supplements that rolled out. Well, cannabis was always off to the side, never a part of any of that, because it was prohibited and not allowed in anything. And so it never got grandfathered in. And so this is where we're at. And that's a really good point that you make, that a lot of the things that are in the supply chain now have skirted around the way new things are handled going forward. And there's a lot of frustration among a lot of people of like, why are we having to jump through all these hoops with cannabis when, we know that there are foods out there that, I could go buy right now that if I ate in abundance every day, I would destroy my kidneys and liver and, all these things. But it's just a weird way that history has played out, and with the passage of rules and the way things get grandfathered in, the way things get excluded, it's a mess. And it's also highlighting the kind of funny, fuzzy distinctions we have between food and medicine and dietary supplements, and that it's all on this spectrum, and it's all it's all foods are drugs, and so it's a tricky thing. And maybe much further down the line, because I don't see it happening in my lifetime, but maybe eventually we overhaul the way that foods and drugs and dietary supplements are managed altogether to better recognize some of those fuzzy distinctions. I mean, there are medical foods now, in sort of these categories. Other countries have kind of handled it better in certain cases, where they kind of have simpler pathways for medicinal plants and stuff to go through to be treated as a medical food or as an actual medicine, but in herbal form.
Germany seems to be really good at that. I like a lot of what Germany does, particular, but they have a long history of it. Like you said, the U.S. is, and so I think that's the other side, is the United States, because I feel like primarily the people who made the rules in our country were white Europeans, and they were here in a country where the plants that were being used primarily were not plants that they were aware of, and so they criminalized them and didn't recognize the medicinal value of. And meanwhile, you have the same types of people in their native countries recognizing the value of these plants, which are natively there, and making rules for them. And I think that kind of removing Europeans culturally from Europe almost separated us culturally from plant medicine in the United States, more so than other places, because it removed the heritage, I suppose, or tradition of that here comparatively, because the people who had that tradition were the natives who didn't really have any allowance to make rules.
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. Yeah. They're just excluded from the conversation altogether.
So that's another aspect with what Panacea is trying to do, is that we've reached out to some groups to try and we're still looking for some. So I hope maybe somebody will hear this, but we've reached out to groups at the Native American churches who utilize peyote and things, and others, because we've filed patents for methods to increase the yield in peyote and mescaline for other cactus and compounds, and for our ayahuasca and other plant, Psychotropia vigris, Urbanos copy. And we want to give licenses to groups like that and offer equity in our company for free to groups that traditionally have utilized these things so that way they can benefit from it, because I wouldn't be doing the research I am if, even though these substances were illegal, they didn't fight the court cases like the peyote case against the federal government to be able to have these things and to be able to keep their traditional medicine. And so they have been disenfranchised. And so I think it's important to do that. And I think you're seeing that more in the psychedelic community than you had with businesses than you did in the cannabis community. And I'm loving it, especially in Canada. There's groups like Field Trip and things they have. And I'm not saying that no one is, like, I'm not trying to, but I'm just specifying people I know who are. And it's just great. They have groups that are working with tribal groups or forming, trying to have equity with those groups and having stakeholders that are from tribes, and and also offering equity to the scientists that are involved more. And I think they've said something like 30% of their equity for the entire company is going to be devoted to either scientists or indigenous groups. And it's like things like that, which to me is my vision of capitalism.
Yes.
So Pete Buttigieg, I don't really like capitalism. I lean more towards socialism, but I also like the idea of people being able to make decisions and not have this top-down control as much. So how do you blend those types of ideals? And I think that it's changing the societal views is a better way than laws sometimes. And if you can encourage people and create your own entities this way, then you can do that. You just create what you want to see.
That's right. Yeah. And you pointed out MAPS earlier, and MAPS recently spun out a public benefit corporation off of their nonprofit. And I think these public benefit corp models is sort of the new wave of what you're talking about, that a lot of companies are trying to write in some of these equity pieces into their bylaws, into their articles of incorporation and everything, and basically saying, like, even if I lose control over this company, by our very structure, we're about more than just maximizing shareholder value. Or if we're all about maximizing shareholder value, we're specific about who those shareholders have to be, how we're tying them in.
And we want to give them equity early. So that's our goal right now, is to find these groups, because we're starting to talk to people who invest in us. And it's that situation where I want them to get as much from it as possible. So the more they're involved, then their stock will just be worth more and more. Yep. And then they'll benefit from it. So additionally, yes, just do it that way. But if you just give them control early, then it's even more beneficial, I would hope. I mean, but it's also, I'm finding resistance in some groups. My family my stepfather is full Native American. And then I also have some history of mine, and that has allowed us to have access to some of the groups to have these discussions. And there's natural hesitancy because I'm majority Caucasian individual and a male.
Very white.
I was like, and so I understand the hesitancy, and it's interesting because of the history that even when you're trying to do the right thing, sometimes people are scared of you.
And for good reason. I mean,
that's why I don't blame them. I lived in the Caribbean in the British Virgin Islands, and I worked at a newspaper there for a while. And and there's groups there who hate white people and don't want them there. And because of what happened, I'm kind of hard pressed to be mad at them.
Right. Yeah. It's like, I get it. Like, you have every right to be upset. Yeah, absolutely. And once again, stop me if you're running short on time. But I wanted
10 minutes, about 10 or 12 more minutes.
Okay, that's perfect. Because I wanted to bring this around to talking about Hunter S. Thompson. I wasn't going to let you go without talking about this. So, yes, show the tattoo. Yep. I wish I had my shirt on. I've got a shirt with that logo on it. I do have my books back here. I don't know if anybody can see them, but I've got a little Hunter S. Thompson little set here. There you go. Yeah. And I don't know if you've seen this one. It's not by Hunter S. Thompson, but it's actually by Ralph Steadman. Have you ever seen this?
I have. Yeah. Steadman's amazing. I don't even drink alcohol anymore, but like I love seeing the beer aisle with his work on. I can't remember which brewery it is, but
I know. Yeah. I've seen it before. Yeah. So let's just, leaving all of this other stuff that we've talked about behind to go on a tangent here on something I think is very important on a personal level. What is it about Hunter S. Thompson that kind of draws you to his spirit? I mean, I know you're a journalism, and you've worked not just in journalism, but also in sports journalism. So there's obviously a deep connection there. And anyone that maybe isn't familiar with Hunter S. Thompson, I mean, one, just do a Google search. By God, I mean, geez, but huge journalist, and particularly got his fame when he was doing a lot of sports journalism. But just speak a little bit about that. Why are you so passionate about Hunter S. Thompson, and maybe what are some things we could learn from his perspective in this day and age?
Oh, definitely. So I'm from Barstow, California as well.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
And anyone who's seen Fear and Loathing might know that it is backcountry or read the book.
Exactly.
And so having the interest in journalism, science, and the things I do, and being from there and being exposed to that early on in my life, kind of even before I ever took a psychedelic, I saw that movie and read those books.
Me too.
And so that and The Doors of Perception, although Huxley's also a hero, but back to, which I also feel like he, affected Huxley, or affected him, because
other way around, yeah.
That's almost the first step of gonzo journalism, because he took it and wrote about it. Nobody did. I mean, there's a few people, but that's like the 60s. That was when people started doing that. And so then you have Hunter S. Thompson, who I'm sure read that book and was exposed to that, and then sees that, but then also was doing journals at the time. And it's just, I connected with it because like I said, the PTSD and other issues is just, I feel like you rebel also when you're younger. And I initially had mistrust of these organizations. And as I've learned more, I've understood more why things exist, so I understand them. Mm-hmm. But I still have never voted for I always vote for a third party candidate because I have distrust of systems as well. Mm-hmm. And I think that people need to learn to work inside them. But what I think is interesting is that I think there's a lot of knowledge to be gained outside of facts. Or sometimes as a journalist, I know things that I couldn't put in an article because I couldn't prove it. I couldn't, mm-hmm. I didn't have a fact. I couldn't put my personal view on something, or I was always trying not to. And so there is value for unbiased reporting, and that is very, very important. However, there is also value in subjective and other reporting, because there's information that cannot be shared through that method. And I think they're both valuable as long as you are open about which is which.
Yes.
And so his questioning of people like Nixon, obviously, and also his views on politics aligned with mine and a lot of ways like that. I almost would be an anarchist and libertarian if it wasn't for my realization as Sinclair also influenced me, that people will do anything. And so
same here.
That's why if you want to do it to yourself, that I think that also, though, that Hunter S. Thompson spoke about protecting people. He wasn't just about doing whatever you wanted. He was trying to protect the small person. He was trying to protect the individual against the government, against the business, against whatever that thing was. And I believe
force is, yeah.
And sometimes that's violence or craziness. And it can be effective. People don't often like that, but I don't believe that Martin Luther King would have been as effective without Malcolm X. I don't think that he would have been effective as it wasn't for the Black Panthers. All of these things influence each other. They don't exist in a vacuum.
Yep. Yeah.
And so I just think that he had a huge role on me in those views. And I think that also it teaches you to share your stories and to challenge authority and to have those questions. But you don't have to challenge it in a way that gets you in trouble or arrested either. So it's just, I don't know. I think is just a fascinating individual, but I also enjoyed his wife's take. I don't know if you've read much, and that she indicated that while some of the drug use and some of the insanity was helpful, that he also suffered from mental illness, and that a lot of it was coping with that, and that he went overboard and made it worse, and that he could have had many years more productivity and happiness and more happiness had he limited that somewhat. And I agree to some extent. And like I said, I don't drink anymore. And so Aldous Huxley touches on this in a lot of his work, to go back to him about the quantification of the life of a beef eater versus a heroin addict, basically being, someone who's sober versus someone who lives to be 80 versus someone who dies at 50 or 30 and utilizes drugs but experiences ecstasy. What is right? And I don't think there is a right or a wrong. I mean, that's a tough discussion. And I
Yeah.
think that society values productivity for obvious reasons. But I also think that, to go deeper into a tangent, that artificial intelligence and robotics are going to replace humans for the majority of industry, and that COVID exposed the need for that due to human interaction causing illness spread in situations of emergency. And it's just going to happen. And if, similarly to all these other things, if we don't start socializing that, taxing it, or creating a way for the government and the people to all access it equally, we're going to end up in the same situation where business overtakes it. And the other thing is, then what are we going to all do for money? So if you're against socialism, that's fine for whatever reason. But I'm telling you right now, it's the Star Trek model where we don't need to make food. We don't need to make, is coming. Nuclear fusion. I don't care if I sound crazy. I don't care. Nuclear fusion is coming, and we won't need power anymore. And when these things happen, I believe in our lifetime, what are we going to do as a society, as a world? And I don't think that any of our systems are designed for this.
Yeah. And there's no serious discussion about it. I mean, when you bring it up, this was something that very lightly Andrew Yang sort of tried to bring to the presidential discussions, like the coming automation and, just how widespread it's going to be and what are people going to do? What do you do with all these displaced people that no longer, their jobs become completely irrelevant? It's a huge thing. What do we do with our time? What do we actually value about life? Like, what's the point if we don't have to work? What do we do? And this actually touches, and I'll start to
look at the time machine. The time machine. Right? Yeah. I mean, like, that touches on it very well because it's like the thread of that. And so but it doesn't. You can be afraid of it, but it's coming.
It is, and like I think I have a book back here by Nozick, Robert Nozick, that wrote about the thought experiment of the experience machine, which Aldous Huxley brings up in Brave New World, of like getting into this future where you don't really have to do anything, and you also have the ability to jump into whatever experiences you want to have through either virtualization or whatever, or just a expansion of resources. And so these are important thought experiments to have, and to plug something I'm working on, and then I'll close all of this. But I'm working on a new podcast that will launch hopefully at the end of this year, but because I've been itching to talk about things beyond cannabis, because cannabis really is such a small part of all of my life, even though I like to do so much work with it. So I have a new podcast coming called Isn't Life Curious? And the whole point of that is to focus on science and philosophy topics with the hope of pressing people to think about some of these very issues of what's the point of being alive? Like, what are we doing here? And how do we spend our time when there aren't requirements to make money, all these things. And that's a small piece of some of the things I want to explore, but it is a huge part of the philosophical aspect. These are conversations that aren't just like funny things to talk about, that's like interesting, intellectual, opium or something, but it's real, and it's just a matter of time. It's like, will it happen in our lifetime or the next? It seems like it could very well happen in our lifetime, as far as the dominoes really starting to fall. And I think I agree with you that COVID has highlighted how fast it can actually happen under pressure, that when there is some sort of widespread issue, that some of these technological advances happen very, very quickly. The virtualization of education is a great example of that. I'm not saying that's gone well, but the speed at which all of a sudden new tools and resources and stuff are being made available so that people can teach from anywhere and take classes from anywhere, which is already coming into play. But I mean, in 1 year, there's been a massive infrastructure change that is not going to go away. Even when in-person learning comes back, virtualized education is here to stay. And there are going to be other examples of that. I think there are going to be other forces at play, just like you're talking about, of widespread automation of certain jobs, that now there's even more pressure because businesses are recognizing, like, we don't know what's going to happen next after COVID, or is there going to be another thing that we have to deal with, and how do we prepare for if people can't come into work? How do we keep things moving and the business sustainable? So these are all real things that we need to talk about. And something I appreciated from Hunter S. Thompson was like you're saying, there's value in learning from perspective and being able to get into someone else's eyes, sort of, and to see the world the way that they do. And even if you don't agree with the way they see the world, to take away some insight, or even if it just pushes you to question how you view things. I think that was a big value that Hunter S. Thompson brought. And even I tell people when I go to cannabis conferences, I feel very much like Hunter S. Thompson, because I feel like I'm walking around seeing a bunch of lizards. I mean, now everyone in the industry is going to hate me, but I mean, it sort of feels that way.
Well, I can say that every MJ BizCon, at least once I'm on something. So
yeah, I mean, it makes it a lot easier. I mean, it's fascinating. There's a lot to learn from watching how people are responding to all of these trends and what their motivations are and everything. And yeah, it may not be necessarily fact-based journalism, but there's huge value in that perspective. And I view it extremely valuable from a philosophical perspective, because I think philosophical insight and critical thinking is something that we have largely eroded in our culture, and that we need to bring back. And
well,
I know, oh, go ahead.
Sorry, I have to touch on this because I agree. And I think that it also plays to the potential fears of what will happen when these things happen, like in the time machine of people seeking bliss and
Yes.
1984 and Brave New World, and the fear of, if people seek bliss and avoid negative things, then will they want to learn? Will they want and so right. Because negative experiences can be informing, or sometimes the ability to access knowledge takes pain to be sometimes.
Yes.
Or work. And so I think that it's something that, like, people always ask me things, and it's like, I'm obsessed. I do this constantly. Like, I like learning knowledge, but like, it's not always, I'm not always healthy with my time management.
Yeah, likewise. Yeah. I mean, I just got over a bout of shingles because I stressed myself out so much, not taking care of myself, that I ended up triggering a shingles outbreak.
I have rotator cuff and trigger finger from too much stuff like that. So it's something that I've had to learn is balance. And
yep.
Before the ketamine, actually, there was a window in that time period after it, psychedelics, where I was better about it because I hadn't gotten as busy. And it's one of those things where it's like, those things help, but then it's like finding that balance again. And so it's like everything. And so you realize that even if you know these things, you can get out of balance.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I teach people all the time, and I still, disregard a lot of the very things that I teach on a regular basis because I'm a human. And so that's just the way it goes.
Well, thank you so much. This has been great.
Yeah, I knew this would be a good conversation. I had a really good sense about it, and I'd love to get together with you again and continue the conversations as more comes about. So let me know as things progress with both your companies and any of your endeavors. I mean, I follow you, but keep me looped in, and we'll come back around and chat some more. I'm sure. I mean, a lot of the stuff that we set up here, we could go on for hours about, I'm sure. So I look forward to seeing what all you guys pull through, and keep up the great work with, not just, what you're doing with your companies, but also, the role that, you're playing just in the communication of ideas, both scientific and philosophical. I take that very seriously, and I really value that when I find people that, kind of hone in on that, whether it's just a natural expression of who you are or whatever. I think that's extremely valuable, and we need more of. So keep it up.
Well, thank you so much. I really like the work that you've been doing, and so this is something I wanted to do and get on your show for a while. So I'm excited to see this come out. And like I mentioned the workshop earlier, and I know that you're one of your sponsors. So yeah, just again, they were one of the innovators. So I also feel humbled that I've just been able to be in the right place at the right time.
Likewise. Yep. It's a lot goes unsaid about that, but a lot of it is right place at the right time, and taking advantage of the opportunities you have in front of you, I think, is a huge piece of that. But yeah, everyone listening, go check out Panacea Plant Sciences and Ziese Farms and David Heldreth and all of the awesome things that they have going on. Check out their patents, and I hope that after this conversation, people listening will have a better perspective of how you're coming at the patenting and everything. And I think it's going to be really exciting when people get a better sense of your full vision there. There's a lot of great things going on. So anyway, thanks so much, everybody, for tuning in. If you've listened this long, congratulations. You've made it an hour and a half. You can find Curious About Cannabis, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And you can also check us out at cacpodcast.com. And with that, stay curious and take it easy. Bye-bye. If you want to learn more about cannabis, check out the Curious About Cannabis book on Amazon.com and other major online book retailers.